Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we're the IB English guys. And today is our third video of our Paper 2 series, and we're going to talk about the all-important thesis statement.
Mr. Giles, a thesis is indeed important. Students, just a reminder, the first video we looked at breaking down the question and pulling out key elements. The second video we talked about brainstorming and mind mapping and trying to figure out what we're going to write about. Now it's time to put those ideas into a really powerful thesis statement that will guide and control your Paper 2 response.
That's right. Today we're gonna walk through this process briefly, and we're gonna use two texts. We're going to use The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is one of my favorite novels to teach. This is an Indian novel written in 1990. And we're going to use Death and the Maiden by Ariel Dorfman, which is a play also written around 1990 and by Ariel Dorfman.
That's right. And this is interesting because remember, we're meant to compare and contrast both content and form. So in this case, we have some really interesting thematic messages, but we have a novel versus a play. So we have quite a bit we can talk about with form, Mr. Giles.
Yeah, that's going to get some good differences to really talk about. That's excellent. Okay, what do you say we tackle the question first and break down that question?
Sure. The question for today is as follows. Compare and contrast how and to what effect authors use literature as a microcosm of society with reference to two works you have studied. All right, Giles, let's break down the question. What are some words we want to hit there?
We're thinking about compare and contrast. We always want to remember that this is a comparison contrast paper. We're being asked to look at similarities and differences.
The IB's made it easy this time. They put it in the question.
They did.
We want to think about this idea of how and to what effect. Again, this has been made easy for us because we want to think about, the how is the craft and to what effect is how, how is that thematic message influencing or impacting audience. So we have that built into the question as well.
Right. The last thing we want to unpack is the word microcosm. This is a favorite of many literature teachers. We want to think about a microcosm being a tiny world. And that's saying that the characters of the world of the piece of literature represent larger society.
Yeah, that could be allegorical in nature, correct?
That's right. That's right.
In this video, we've already looked at brainstorming via a T-chart. We've looked at making a mind map. Today, we're just going to make some lists and see if that suits you as well. So why don't we take a stab at that, Mr. Giles? Let's do some brainstorming for text A, the God of Small Things.
Okay, we're thinking about text A being a microcosm of post-colonial India in 1969. So we might first think about the Ipe family and how the family members represent different segments of society.
That's right. We have Papachi, of course, is the grandfather, and he represents the older generation, sort of who's favoring and empathetic and sympathetic toward British culture.
Yeah, Amu is a divorced single female who's being ostracized, and she represents that segment of society.
We have Baby Kochama. Of course, she's the resentful aunt, and she is sort of clinging to that hierarchy of the caste system, despite the fact that India is making progress in this time and space.
Right. Besides the Ipe family, we have other characters. We have the all-important Velutha. He represents in this microcosm, the untouchable caste.
Yeah,
I think that's important.
We have Inspector Thomas. He is sort of representing that corrupt police element of Indian society for the given context. And of course, we have Comrade Pillai. He's the self-serving politician who's really not thinking about the people, but is thinking about himself and how he can climb in society.
That's great. Now we want to think about how. How does Arundhati Roy convey this microcosm? We're thinking about that third-person omniscient narrator that we might want to talk about. That's a really good way.
Yeah, we want to think about symbolism. In God of Small Things, there are just vast numbers of symbols. That's one of Roy's strongest attributes as a writer, is her craft. I think we have many symbols we could choose from, Mr. Giles.
That's right, that connect to those segments of society. We also have a non-linear structure. We have the back and forth between 1969 and 1990, and I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, we're doing some good work here, but we're kind of just describing. Now we need to think about the so what, Mr. Giles. What is the effect? Why is this so important? And I think Arundhati Roy's message is she wants her audience to really understand and acknowledge these inequalities that are embedded in the caste system and the lack of social justice that is pervasive in post-colonial Indian society.
Yeah, she is a passionate political activist, and she's trying to give a voice to the voiceless and really create sympathy for oppressed people. So that is really the effect.
Let's stay with this method and let's flip over to text B, Death and the Maiden. And in this case, we're looking at 1990 Chile in a post-dictatorship.
That's right.
So let's think about how this works, Mr. Giles, with respect to the guiding question. So let's think about the microcosm.
Okay, so in this case, we only have 3 characters, really, that represent that microcosm. So that's interesting. That's different. But we want to think about Paulina. who she represents in this greater society. She's a victim of this the violence that has from in the past.
Yeah, and similarly, we have Roberto, who's a lawyer, and he's sort of representing the legal system and justice in this case, and he's sort of torn between what was and what has become now. So he represents that uncertainty as we transition from one regime to another.
Yeah, it was Gerardo was the
I'm
lawyer.
sorry, Gerardo. Yes,
Yeah.
I misspoke.
No, it's okay. And Roberto, of course, he represents the sort of perpetrator and the accused of what he's done. And so he represents the past dictatorship.
Yeah, now in this case, we want to think about the how, the craft. And Dorfman really does a nice job with lighting, setting, and other dramatic elements throughout the play. So maybe you want to focus on some of those stage directions.
Ooh, that's good. So we got some different differences that we could talk about. We also want to talk about the sort of character development and the dialogue that's used to convey this microcosm, to show how these characters feel about.
Yeah, we could look at the music motif of Death and the Maiden. Of course, that's the work from Schubert. And we want to think about how that comes at different times, especially at the end of the play in that ambiguous moment where Death and the Maiden is playing. So music is really critical. So Dorfman's using music where Roy does not.
That's right. Okay, now we're getting out that we need to talk about the effect. What's the greater purpose with Dorfman?
Mr. Giles, we have to make some decisions and acknowledge the complexity of justice. It's not always black and white, cut and dry. There are moral and ethical implications we must consider, and those can be quite ambiguous at times. I think that's what he's chasing.
And he's also trying to force the audience to consider stopping the cycle of terror, this idea of like violence begetting violence. There's something he's making us think about, right?
Yeah, we have the elusiveness of truth. There's some really interesting references to the truth, the real truth, and the real truth, and thinking about how truth can be fleeting, especially in times during a dictatorship.
And like Roy, he's trying to give voice to the voiceless. So these are ideas that we have in mind. Now, we want to get at a thesis statement. For a comparative essay, we want to think about a thesis statement that has a few elements in that. Let's talk about the elements of a thesis statement.
Definitely, Mr. Giles, you want to have the names of the works and the names of the authors. That's critical to the introduction. We need to have both those elements in play.
We also want to make sure we're using the wording of the question. This tells our reader that we are focusing, we are answering that question.
Yeah, this is a compare and contrast paper, so we want to acknowledge similarities and differences in the thesis statement, and we're going to need some comparative language elements to pull that off effectively.
And lastly, most importantly, I would say, is that we need to have an argument. We need to really have a rich idea that we're trying to convey.
Yeah, we're not just making observations about the text. We're using these observations and evidence to articulate our argument, which of course is a reflection of the arguments of the playwrights or authors themselves.
I like to let the authors make my argument for me. And in this case, that's what we're doing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we've got 3 different models of thesis statements that we can use for a comparison contrast paper. The first model is where we emphasize the similarities. By that, I mean we're saying, yes, they are different, but the similarities perhaps are a little bit more striking to me. So we're acknowledging the differences, but emphasizing the similarities.
Let me read one out, Mr. Giles.
Okay, go.
While the God of Small Things and Death and the Maiden use very different means to depict a microcosm of their respective societies, both Roy and Dorfman create these mini-worlds to sharply criticize oppression and inequalities, and also to give a voice to the voiceless victims.
Okay, so we're acknowledging, in this case, yes, they use different techniques, different means, where one's a play, one's a novel. So we're acknowledging those differences. We're saying that the most important thing is that both authors criticize the oppression. I like that.
I like it too. Students, notice the use of the word while, then that is followed by a comma. So you have a really complex sentence here that captures the differences on one side and the similarities on the other.
Yeah, and like grammatically, the subordinate clause is the one that has the less important thing, right? So that's
working. Yeah,
it's working. Okay, now we can flip it around and we can emphasize the differences. We can say, yes, they are similar in this way, but the differences, I think, are more striking.
Although both Arundhati Roy in her novel, The God of Small Things, and Ariel Dorfman in his drama Death and the Maiden create microcosms to sharply criticize oppression and inequalities, they use drastically different means to create these mini-worlds as a result of the chosen genre and complexities of their works.
Ooh, okay. So in this case,
Mr. Giles, it appears that the student is going to focus on the literary forms. And yes, they do have similar messages, but I really want to talk about how playwrights leverage technique to show that message versus how a novelist leverages their techniques to show the message. Those are very, very different, and that's going to be the emphasis of this particular paper.
Yeah, we noticed that there's a rich idea in both of these example thesis statements. Now, these sentences are kind of long. And so,
Mr. Giles, I'm not going to lie. They're cumbersome, they're long. I have many students who cannot write with grammatical accuracy and include that complexity, that sophistication. What do you recommend?
You break it up. Break it into 2 sentences. Nothing wrong with making it 2 sentences. So let's look at it. Let's look at a sample.
You read this one.
Okay. Because of the contrasting genres and degree of complexity of their works, there exist vast differences in the techniques used in The God of Small Things and Death and the Maiden to depict a microcosm of their respective societies. However, Arundhati Roy and Ariel Dorfman create these mini-worlds to sharply criticize oppression and inequalities, and also to give a voice to the voiceless victims.
Yeah, for me, Mr. Giles, I think this is cleaner. While the first 2 were accurate, I would encourage a lot of my students to make this into 2 sentences. It looks like we're going to, again, put the focus on the similarities and how they're criticizing oppression in this paper, while also talking about the vast differences in technique.
That's right. That's exactly what we're doing. So it's not like one is better than the other. These are just 3 models, but I think the essence is that we have an argument, we have a rich idea, we are definitely going to consider similarities and differences in writing this paper.
Now, students, you may think, wow, these are really complex, but remember, you have an hour and 45 minutes to write this paper. You need to say something substantial, so definitely do some outside reading, discuss these texts with your teacher in great detail, collaborate with your friends and peers, and you too will have something important and significant to share.
Our next video is going to talk about how to organize a paper too, and how to add some different strategies in doing that.
Yeah, so make sure you join us for our next video. We'll talk about 2 different types of organization. Again, we hope these are helping you out. Stay with the channel, and we will continue to guide you in your paper 2 endeavors. Thanks for joining, and take care.
Thanks, guys.